Hello, everyone. I'm going to be reading chapter 5 of Robert Greene's The Mastery, and we're also going to celebrate for our 10 subscribers. Very cool. You just gotta grab the pillow and find the right page. Okay, chapter 5. Awaken the dimensional mind, the creative, active. As you accumulate more skills and internalize the rules that govern your field, your mind will want to become more active, seeking to use this knowledge in ways that are more suited to your inclinations. What will impede this natural creative dynamic from flourishing is not a lack of talent, but your attitude. Feeling anxious or insecure, you will tend to turn conservative with your knowledge, preferring to fit into the group and sticking to the procedures you have learned. Instead, you must force yourself in the opposite direction instead of feeling complacent about what you know. You must expand your knowledge to related fields, giving your mind fuel to make new associations between different ideas. You must experiment and look at problems from all possible angles. As your thinking grows more fluid, your mind will become increasingly dimensional, seeing more and more aspects of reality. The second transformation. From the moment he was born, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart (1756 to 1791) was surrounded by his music. His father Leopold was a violinist and composer in the court of Salzburg, Austria, as well as a music instructor. All during the day, Wolfgang would hear Leopold and his students practicing in the house. In 1759, his 7-year-old sister Maria Anna began taking piano lessons from their father. She showed great promise and practiced at all hours. Wolfgang, enchanted by the simple melodies that she played, began to hum along the music. He would sometimes sit at the family harpsichord and try to imitate what his sister had played. Leopold could soon detect that something unusual in his son. For a 3-year-old, the child had a remarkable memory for melody and an impeccable sense of rhythm, all without having had any instruction. Although he had never attempted to teach someone so young, Leopold decided to begin teaching piano to Wolfgang when he turned 4, and only after a few sessions he realized the boy had other interesting qualities. Wolfgang listened more deeply than other students, his mind and body completely absorbed in the music. With such intensity and focus, he learned more quickly than other children. Once he was 5 years old, he stole a rather complicated exercise meant for Maria Anna, and within 30 minutes he could play it with ease. He had heard Maria Anna practice the piece and remembering it vividly. The moment he saw the notes on the page, he could rapidly reproduce the music. This remarkable focus had its root in something that Leopold saw almost from the beginning. The boy had an intense love of music itself. His eyes would light up with excitement the moment Leopold laid out a new challenging piece for him to conquer if the piece was new and hard to figure out. He would attack it day and night with such tenacity that it would soon become part of his repertoire. At night, his parents would have to force him to stop practicing and send him to bed. This love of practice only seemed to increase with the years. One day in 1762, as Leopold Mozart heard his two children playing piece for two pianos, an idea came to him. His daughter Maria Anna was a very talented piano player in her own right, and Wolfgang was a veritable marvel. Together, they were like precious toys. They had a natural charisma, and Wolfgang had a showman's flair. As a mere court musician, Leopold's income was rather limited, but he could see the potential for making a fortune through his children. And so, thinking this through, he decided to take his family on a grand tour of the capitals of Europe, playing before royal courts and the public and charging money for the entertainment. To add to the spectacle, he dressed the children up, Maria Anna as a princess and Wolfgang as a court minister, complete with wig, elaborate waistcoat, and a sword dangling from his belt. They began in Vienna, where the children charmed the Austrian emperor and empress. Then they spent months in Paris, where they played for the royal court, and Wolfgang bounced on the knee of the delighted King Louis XV. They continued to London, where they ended up staying over for a year, playing before all kinds of large crowds. And while the sight of the two children in their costumes charmed audiences enough, Wolfgang's playing astonished them. He would play in his own compositions. It was impressive to hear a sonata composed by a 7-year-old, no matter how simple it was. Most marvelous of all, Wolfgang could play at an incredible speed, his tiny little fingers flying over the keyboard. As the tour continued, Wolfgang developed the habit of attaching himself to the most illustrious composer in the particular court they were visiting. In London, for instance, he managed to charm the great composer Johann Christian Bach, son of Johann Sebastian Bach. The education he received in this fashion from all of the composers he met went far beyond anything any child could hope to receive. The Mozart family had come now to depend on the money that the children had generated through the tour, but as the years went by, the invitations began to dry up. The novelty had worn off, and the children no longer seemed so young and precious. Desperate to generate money, Leopold came up with a different scheme. His son was turning into a serious composer with the ability to compose in different genres. What was needed was to secure him for a stable position as a court composer and attract commissions for concertos and symphonies. With this goal in mind, in 1770, father and son embarked on a series of tours of Italy, then the center of all things musical in Europe. The trip went well. Wolfgang performed its magic on the piano before all of the major courts in Italy. He gained acclaim for his symphonies and concert pieces. They were quite impressive for a teenager. He mingled yet again with the most celebrated composers of his time, intensifying the musical knowledge he had gained on his previous tours. In addition, he rediscovered his greatest passion in music, the opera. As a child, he had always had the feeling that he was destined to compose great operas. In Italy, he saw the finest productions and realized the source of his fascination. It was a drama translated into pure music, the nearly limitless potential of the human voice to express the full range of emotion, and the overall spectacle. He had an almost primal attraction to any kind of theater, but despite all of the attention and inspiration he received, after nearly 3 years of visiting the various courts of Italy, he was not offered a position or a commission that was worthy of his talents. And so in 1773, father and son returned to Salzburg. After some delicate negotiation with the Archbishop of Salzburg, Leopold finally managed to secure for his son a relatively lucrative position as court musician and composer. And by all appearances, the arrangement was good. Not having to worry about money, Wolfgang would have endless time to work on composing, but almost from the beginning, Wolfgang felt uncomfortable and restless. He had spent almost half of his youth traveling throughout Europe, mingling with the leading minds in music and listening to the most renowned orchestras, and now he was relegated to life in provincial Salzburg. Isolated from the European centers of music in a city that had no theater or opera tradition, more troubling, however, was the mounting frustration he felt as a composer. For as long as he could remember, his head was continuously filled with music, but it was always the music of other people. He knew that his own pieces were simply clever imitations and adaptations of other composers. He had been like a young plant, passively absorbing nutrients from the environment in the form of the different styles he had learned and mastered. But he could feel stirring from deep within something more active, the desire to express his own music and stop imitating. The soil was now rich enough. As an adolescent, he was assailed by all kinds of conflicting and powerful emotions: elation, depression, erotic desires. His great desire was to transpose these feelings into his work. Almost without being aware of it, he began to experiment what he wrote. He wrote a series of slow movements for various string quartets that were long and drawn out with strange mixes of moods, full of anxiety that would rise to great crescendos. When he showed these pieces to his father, Leopold was horrified. Their income depended on Wolfgang supplying the court with these kind of pleasant melodies that would delight people. If they or the archbishop heard these new compositions, they would think Wolfgang had gone insane. Besides, the pieces were too complicated for the court musicians of Salzburg to perform. He begged his son to stop indulging in such strange music. Wolfgang acquiesced, but as time went on, he grew increasingly depressed. For the first time in his life, he was losing his love for music itself. Feeling imprisoned, he grew irritable. Slowly, he resigned himself to his fate. He would die in Salzburg at an early age without the world ever hearing the kind of music he knew existed within him. In 1781, Wolfgang was invited to accompany the Archbishop of Salzburg to Vienna, where he was planning to showcase the musical talents of his various court musicians. Suddenly, in Vienna, the nature of his status as a court musician became clear. The archbishop ordered him about as if he were simply one of his personal staff, a mere servant. Now all the resentment Wolfgang had felt for the past 7 years bubbled and rose to the surface. He was 25 years old and losing valuable time. His father and the archbishop were actively holding him back. He loved his father and depended on his family for emotional support, but he could tolerate his circumstances no longer. When it was time to return to Salzburg, he did the unthinkable. He refused to leave. He asked to be dismissed from his position. The archbishop treated him with the utmost contempt, but finally relented. His father sided with the archbishop and ordered his son to return, promising that all would be forgiven. But Wolfgang had made up his mind he would stay in Vienna for what would turn out to be the rest of his life. The rift with his father was permanent and extremely painful, but sensing that his time was short and that he had almost too much to express, he threw himself into his music with an intensity that was even greater than what he had displayed in childhood. As if all of his ideas had been pent up for too long, he exploded in a creative outburst unprecedented in the history of music. His apprenticeship of the past 20 years had prepared him for this moment. He had developed a prodigious memory. In his mind, he could hold together all of the harmonies and melodies that he had absorbed over the years. Instead of notes or chords, he could think in terms of blocks of music and write them out as quickly as he heard them in his head. He gave his compositions the power to convey dread, sadness, foreboding, anger, exhilaration, and ecstasy. Audiences were spellbound by this new sweeping sound that suddenly had so many new dimensions. After these innovations, it became almost impossible for composers to return to the light, frothy chord music that had previously prevailed. European music had forever been altered. These innovations did not spring from any conscious desire on his part to provoke or rebel. Rather, his transforming spirit emerged as it were completely natural and beyond his control. Like a bee secreting wax, aided by his superior sense of music, he simply could not help but personalize every genre he worked in. In 1786, he came upon a version of the Don Juan legend that excited him. He immediately identified with the story of the great seducer. He shared Don Juan's obsessive need and love for women, and he had the same disdain for authority figures. But more importantly, Mozart felt that as a composer, he had the supreme ability to seduce audiences, and that music itself represented the ultimate seduction. With its irresistible power to strike at our emotions, translating the story into an opera, he could convey all of these ideas. And so the following year he began work on his opera Don Giovanni, Italian for Don Juan, to make the story come alive in the way he had imagined. He would once again apply his transformative powers at this time to the genre of opera. At the time, operas tended to be rather static and formulaic. They consisted of recitatives, spoken dialogue accompanied by harpsichord that conveyed the story in action. Arias sung portions in which the singer would react to the information in their recitative, and choral pieces featuring large groups of people singing together. For his opera, Mozart created something that flowed as a continuous whole. He conveyed the character of Don Giovanni not just through the words but through the music, accompanying the seducer's presence on stage with a constant twitching tremolo in the violins to represent his nervous, sensual energy. He gave the work an accelerated, almost frantic pace that no one has ever witnessed before in the theater. To push the expressive value of the music further, he invented ensembles, stirring climactic moments in which several characters would sing, sometimes over one another in an elaborate counterpoint, giving the opera a dream-like feel and flow. From beginning to end, Don Giovanni resonated with the demonic presence of the great seducer. Although all of the other characters condemn him, it is impossible not to admire Don Giovanni, even as he remains unrepentant to the end, laughing all the way to hell and refusing to submit to authority. Don Giovanni was not like any opera anyone had ever seen before, either in the story or in the music. It was perhaps too far ahead of its time. Many complained that it was all rather ugly and harsh to the ears. They found the pace too frenetic and the moral ambiguity too disgusting. Continuing to work at a delirious creative pace, Mozart exhausted himself and died in 1791, 2 months after the premiere of his last opera, The Magic Flute, at the age of 35. Several years after his death, audiences caught up with the radical sound that he created in works such as Don Giovanni, which soon became amongst the five most frequently performed operas in history. Keys to mastery. Several things dovetailed in my mind at once, and at once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, especially in literature, and which Shakespeare possessed so enormously. I mean, negative capability, that is, when man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. John Keats. If we think deeply about our childhood, not just about our memories of it, but how it actually felt, we realize how differently we experienced the world back then. Our minds were completely open and we entertained all kinds of surprising original ideas. Things that we now take for granted often cause us to wonder. Our heads teemed with questions about the world around us, not yet having commanded language. We thought in not ways that were preverbal, in images and sensations. When we attended a circus in a sporting event or a movie, our eyes and ears took in the spectacle with utmost intensity. Colors seemed more vibrant and alive. We had a powerful desire to turn everything around us into a game, to play with circumstances. Let us call this quality the original mind. The mind looked at the world more directly, not through words, and received ideas. It was flexible and receptive to the information, retaining a memory of this original mind. We cannot help but feel nostalgic for the intensity with which we used to experience the world. As the years pass, the intensity inevitably diminishes. We come to see the world through a screen of words and opinions, our prior experiences. Layered over the present color, what we see, we no longer look at things as they are, noticing their details or wonder why they exist. Our minds gradually tighten up, we become defensive about the world we now take for granted and become upset if our beliefs or assumptions are attacked. We can call this way of thinking the conventional mind. Under pressure to make a living and conform to society, we force our minds into tighter and tighter groups. Masters and those who simply display a high level of creative energy are simply people who manage to retain a sizable portion of their childhood spirit despite the pressures and demands of adulthood. This spirit manifests itself in their work and their creative ways of thinking. Children are naturally creative. They actively transform everything around them, play with ideas and circumstances, and surprise us with the novel things they say or do. But the natural creativity of children is limited. It never leads to discoveries, inventions, or substantial works of art. Masters not only retain the spirit of the original mind, but they add it to their years of apprenticeship and an ability to focus deeply on problems or ideas. This leads to a high level creativity. Although they have profound knowledge of a subject, their minds remain open to alternative ways of seeing and approaching problems. They retain a childlike excitement about their field and a playful approach. Some people maintain their childlike spirit and spontaneity, but their creative energy is dissipated in a thousand directions, and they never have the patience or discipline to endure an extended apprenticeship. Others have the disciple to accumulate the discipline to accumulate vast amounts of knowledge and become experts in their field, but they have no flexibility of spirit, so their ideas never stray beyond the conventional and they never become truly creative. Masters manage to blend the two disciples and a childlike spirit together into what we shall call the dimensional mind. Such a mind is not constricted by limited experience or habits. It can branch out in all directions and make a deep contact with reality. It can explore more dimensions of this world. It is actively transforming everything it digests into something new and original, creating instead of consuming. Understand, we all possess an inborn creative force that wants to become active. This is the gift of our original mind, which reveals such potential. The human mind is naturally creative, constantly looking to make associations and connections between things and ideas. What kills the creative force is not age or a lack of talent, but our own spirit, our own attitude. We become too comfortable with the knowledge we have gained in our apprenticeship. We grow afraid of entertaining new ideas and the effort that this requires. What this means, however, is that we equally possess the potential to spark this innate creative force back to life no matter how old we are. By understanding how the dimensional mind works, operates, and what helps it flourish, we can consciously revive our mental elasticity and reverse the deadening process. The powers that the dimensional mind can bring are nearly limitless and within the reach of almost all of us. Look at the case of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He is generally considered the epitome of child prodigy and the inexplicable genius. A freak of nature, how else are we to explain his uncanny abilities at such a young age, and the 10-year burst of creative activity at the end of his life culminated in so many innovations and universally loved works? In truth, his genius and creativity is eminently explicable, which does not at all diminish his achievements. Immersed in and enchanted by music from the very beginning of his life, he brought to his earliest studies a high level of focus and intensity. The mind of a 4-year-old is even more open and impressionable than of a child of a few years older. Much of this powerful attention stemmed from his deep love of music, and so practicing the piano was not some kind of chore or duty, but an opportunity to expand his knowledge and to explore more musical possibilities. By the age of 6, he had accumulated the hours of practice of someone twice his age. The years of touring exposed him to every possible trend and innovation of life. His mind became filled with an extensive vocabulary of forms and styles. In his adolescence, Mozart experienced a typical creative crisis. For close to 8 years, under pressure from his father, he had to temper his own powerful creative urges. At this critical point, he could have succumbed to this dampening of his spirit and continued to write relatively tame pieces for the court. Instead, he rebelled and reconnected with his childlike spirit, that original desire of his to transform the music into his own voice, to realize his dramatic urges in opera. With all of his pent up energy, his long apprenticeship, the deep level of his knowledge, he naturally exploded with his creativity once he had freed himself from his family. The speed with which he could compose such masterpieces is not a reflection of some divine gift, but rather how powerfully his mind had come to think in musical terms, which he could translate easily onto paper. He was not a freak, but a signpost of the outer reaches of creative potential we all naturally possess. The dimensional mind has two essential requirements: a high level of knowledge about a field or subject, and two, the openness and flexibility to use this knowledge in new and original ways. The knowledge that prepared the ground for creative activity largely comes from a rigorous apprenticeship in which we have mastered all of the basics. Once the mind is freed from having to learn these basics, it can focus on higher and more creative matters. The problem for us all is that the knowledge we gain in this apprenticeship phase, including numerous rules and procedures, can slowly become a prison. It locks us into certain methods and forms of thinking that are one-dimensional. Instead, the mind must be forced from its conservative positions and made active and exploratory. To awaken the dimensional mind and move through the creative process requires three essential steps. First, choosing the proper creative task, the kind of activity that will maximize our skills and knowledge. Second, loosening and opening up the mind through creative strategies. And third, creating the optimal mental conditions for a breakthrough or insight. Finally, throughout the process, we must also be aware of the emotional pitfalls, complacency, boredom, grandiosity, and the like that continually threaten to derail or block or progress. If we can move through the steps while avoiding these traps, we cannot fail to unleash powerful creative forces from within. Step 1: the creative task. You must begin by altering your very concept of creativity and by trying to see it from a new angle. To make a discovery, to invent something that connects with the public, to fashion a work of art that is meaningful, inevitably requires time and effort. This often entails years of experimentation, various setbacks and failures, and the need to maintain a high level of focus. You must have patience and faith that what you're doing will yield something important. You can have the most brilliant mind teeming with knowledge and ideas, but if you choose the wrong subject or problem to attack, you can run out of energy and interest. In such a case, all of your intellectual brilliance will lead to nothing. The task that you choose to work on must have an obsessive element. Like the life's task, it must connect to something deep within you. Understand, it is the choice of where to direct his or her creative energy that makes the master. This is the primary law of the creative dynamic that you must engrave deeply in your mind and never forget. Your emotional commitment to what you are doing will be translated directly into your work. If you go at your work with half a heart, It will show in the lackluster results. If you are doing something primarily for money and without real emotional commitment, it will translate into something that lacks a soul and that has no connection to you. You may not see this, you, but you can be sure that the public will feel it and that they will receive your work in the same lackluster spirit it was created in. And if you are excited and obsessive in the hunt, it will show in the details. If your work comes from a place of deep within, its authenticity will be communicated. This applies equally to science and business as to the arts. You must never simply embark on any creative endeavor in your field, placing faith in your own brilliance to see it through. You must make the right, perfect choice for your energies and your inclinations. To aid in this process, it is often wise to choose something that appeals to your sense of unconventionality and calls up latent feelings of rebelliousness. Perhaps what you want to invent or discover is being ignored or ridiculed by others. In opting for something that has deep personal appeal to you, you will naturally move in an orthodox direction. Try to ally this with a desire to subvert conventional paradigms and go against the grain. The sense of having enemies or doubters can serve as a powerful motivating device and fill you with an added creative energy and focus. These are two things to keep in mind. First, the task that you choose must be realistic. The knowledge and skills you have gained must be eminently suited to pulling things off. Second, you must let go of your need for comfort and security. Creative endeavors are by the natures uncertain. You may know your task, but you'll never exactly be sure where your efforts will lead. If you need everything in your life to be simple and safe, this open ended nature of this task will fill you with anxiety. If you're worried about what others might think about you or about how your position in the group might be jeopardized, then you will never really create anything. If you are worried about failure or going through a period of mental and financial instability, then you will violate the primary law of the creative dynamic and your worries will be reflected in the result. Think of yourself as an explorer. You cannot find anything new if you are unwilling to leave the shore. Step 2. Creative strategies. Think of the mind as a muscle that naturally tightens up over time unless it is consciously worked upon. What causes this tightening is twofold. First, we generally prefer to entertain the same thoughts and ways of thinking because they provide us with a sense of consistency and familiarity. Sticking with the same methods we also save us a lot of effort. We are creatures of habit. Second, whenever we work hard at a problem or idea, our minds naturally narrow their focus because of the strain and effort involved. This means that the further we progress on our task, the fewer alternative possibilities or viewpoints we tend to consider. The tightening process afflicts all of us. The only antidote is to enact strategies to loosen up the mind and let in alternative ways of thinking. The following 5 strategies for developing such flexibility have been distilled from the lessons and stories of the most creative masters, past and present. It would be wise to adapt all of them at some point, stretching and losing the mind in all directions. Cultivate negative capability. We are by nature fearful and insecure creatures. We do not like what is unfamiliar or unknown. To compensate for this, we assert ourselves with opinions and ideas that make us seem strong and certain. Many of these opinions do not come from our own deep reflection, but are instead based on what other people think. Furthermore, once we hold these ideas, to admit they are wrong is to wound our own ego and vanity. Truly creative people in all fields can temporarily suspend their ego and simply experience what they are seeing. without the need to assert a judgment for as long as possible. They are more than ready to find their most cherished opinions contradicted by reality. This ability to endure and even embrace mysteries and uncertainties is what the great English poet John Keats called negative capability. All masters possess this negative capability, and it is the source of their creative power. This quality allows them to entertain a broader range of ideas and experiment with them, which in turn makes their work richer and more inventive. To put negative capability into practice, you must develop the habit of suspending the need to judge everything that crosses your path. You consider and even momentarily entertain viewpoints opposite to your own. You observe a person or event for a length of time, deliberately holding yourself back from forming an opinion. You seek out what is unfamiliar. You do anything to break up your normal train of thinking and your sense that you already know the truth. Negative capability should not be a permanent state of mind. In order to produce work of any sort, we must create limits on what we will consider. We must organize our thoughts into relatively cohesive patterns and eventually come up with conclusions. In the end, we must make certain judgments. Negative capability is a tool we use in the process to open the mind up temporarily to more possibilities. B. Allow for serendipity. The brain is an instrument developed for making conscious connections. It operates as a dual processing system in which every bit of information that comes in is at the same time compared to the other information. The brain is constantly searching for similarities, differences, and relationships between what it processes. Your task is to feed this natural inclination, to create the optimal conditions for it to make new and original associates between ideas and experiences. And one of the best ways to accomplish this is by letting go of conscious control and allowing chance to enter into the process. The reason for this is simple. When we are consumed with a particular project, our attention tends to become quite narrow as we focus so deeply. We grow tense. In this state, our mind responds by trying to reduce the amount of stimuli we have to deal with. We literally close ourselves off from the world in order to concentrate on what is necessary. This can have the unintended consequence of making it harder for us to see other possibilities, to be more open and creative with our ideas. When we are in a more relaxed state, our attention naturally broadens as we take in more stimuli. Many of the most interesting and profound discoveries in science occurs when the thinker is not concentrating directly on the problem but is about to drift off to sleep or get on a bus. Or here's a joke. Moments of unstrained attention, when something unexpected enters the mental sphere and triggers a new and fertile connection. Such chance associates and discoveries are known as serendipity, the occurrence of something that we are not expecting, and although by their nature you cannot force them to happen, you can invite serendipity into the creative process by taking two simple steps. The first step is to widen your search as far as possible. In the research stage of your project, you look at more than what is generally required. You expand your search into other fields, reading and absorbing any related information if you have a particular theory or hypothesis about a phenomenon. You examine as many examples and potential counterexamples as humanly possible. It might seem tiring and inefficient, but you must trust the process. What ensures is that the brain becomes increasingly excited and stimulated by the variety of information. A kind of mental momentum is generated in which the slightest chance occurrence will spark a fertile idea. The second step is to maintain an openness and loosening of spirit in moments of great tension and searching. You allow moments of release. You take walks, engage in activities outside your work, or think about something else. No matter how trivial, when some new an unanticipated idea now enters your mind, you do not ignore it because it is irrational or does not fit the narrow frame of your previous work. You give it instead full attention and explore where it leads you. To help yourself to cultivate serendipity, you should keep a notebook with you at all times. The moments any idea or observation comes, you note it down. In this notebook, you record any scrap of thought that occurs to you. Include drawings, quotes from other books, anything at all. In this way, you will have the freedom to try out the most absurd ideas. The juxtaposition of so many random bits will be enough to spark various associations. In general, you must adopt a more analogical way of thinking, taking greater advantage of the associate powers of the mind. Thinking in terms of analogies and metaphors can be extremely helpful to the creative process. These analogies can be tight and logical, such as Isaac Newton's comparison of the falling apple from a tree in his garden to the moon falling in space. Or they can be loose and somewhat irrational, such as the jazz artist John Coltrane thinking about his own composition as cathedrals of sound he was constructing. In any event, you must train yourself to look constantly for such analogies to reframe and expand your ideas. Alternate C. Alternate the mind through the current. The current is like a mental electrical charge that gains its power through a constant alternation. We observe something in the world that strikes our attention and makes us wonder what it might mean. In thinking about it, we devise several possible explanations. When we look at the phenomenon again, we see it differently as we cycle through the various ideas we had imagined to account for it. Perhaps we conduct experiments to verify or alter our speculations. Now, when we look at the phenomenon yet again, weeks or months later, we see more and more aspects of hidden reality. If we had failed to speculate on the meaning of what we had observed, we simply would have had an observation that led us nowhere. If we speculated without continuing to observe and verify, then we simply would have had some random idea floating in our heads. But continually cycling between speculation and observation slash experiment, we are able to pierce deeper and deeper into reality, like a drill that penetrates a piece of wood through its motion. The current is a constant dialogue between our thoughts and reality. If we go into this process deeply enough, we come into contact with a theory that explains something far beyond the capability of our limited senses. Most often in culture, we see people who short circuit the current. They observe some phenomenon in culture or nature that makes them emotional and they run rampant with speculations, never taking the time to entertain possible explanations that could have been verified by further observation. On the other hand, we see many people, particularly in academia or in the sciences, who accumulate mountains of information and data from studies and statistics but never venture to speculate on the larger ramifications of this information or connect it all into a theory. Instead, you must follow the route of all creative thinkers and go in the opposite direction. You not only speculate but are bold and audacious with your ideas, all of which forces you to work hard and to confirm or disconfirm your theories, piercing into reality in the process. As the great physicist Max Planck put it, scientists must have a vivid, intrusive imagination for new ideas are not generated by deduction, but by an artistically creative imagination. The current can be applied to any kind of new invention or business idea. By working with artifacts or prototypes, let us say you have an idea for a new product. You can design it on your own but then launch it. But often you notice a discrepancy between your own level of excitement for your product and the somewhat indifferent response of the public. You have not engaged in a dialogue with reality, which the essence of the current. Instead, it is better to produce a prototype, a form of speculation, and see how people respond to it. Based on the assessments you gain, you can redo the work and launch it again, cycling through this process several times until you perfect it. The responses of the public will make you think more deeply about what you're producing. Such feedback will help make visible what is generally invisible to your eyes. The objective reality of your work and its flaws as reflected through the eyes of many people. Alternating between ideas and artifacts will help you to create something compelling and effective. D. Alter your perspective. Considering thinking as an extended form of vision that allows us to see more of the world, and creativity as the ability to expand that vision beyond conventional boundaries. When we perceive an object, our eyes relay only a portion or outline of it to our brains, leaving our mind to fill in the rest. Giving us a fast and relatively accurate assessment of what we are seeing, our eyes are not paying deep attention to all of the details, but noticing patterns or thought processes modeled after visual perceptions of a similar shorthand. When an event occurs or when we meet a new person, we do not stop to consider all aspects or details, but instead we see an outline or pattern that fits into our expectations and past experiences. We fit the event or person into categories. Creative people are those who have the capacity to resist this shorthand. They can look at a phenomenon from several different angles, noticing something we miss because we only look straight down. Whether such powers are natural or learned does not matter. The mind can be trained to loosen itself up and move outside the grooves. To do this, you must become aware of the typical patterns your mind falls into and how you can break out of these patterns and alter your perspectives through conscious effort. Once you engage in this process, you will be astonished at the idea of creative powers it will unleash. The following are several of the most common patterns or shorthands and how you can subvert them. Looking at the what instead of the how. Let us say that something goes wrong in a project of some sort. Our conventional tendency is to look for a single cause or a simple explanation, which then reveals us how to fix the problem. If the book we are creating is not working out, we focus on the uninspired writing or the misguided conception behind it. Or if the company we work for is not performing well, we look at the products we are designing, and marketing. Although we think we are being rational when we think in this way, most often problems are more complicated and holistic. We are simplifying them based on the law that the mind always looks for shorthands. To look at the how instead of the what means focusing on the structure, how the parts relate to the whole. With a book, it may not be working out because it is originally or organized poorly. The faculty organization, a reflection of ideas that have not been throughout. Improving the structure will improve the writing. With the company, we should look deeply at the organization itself, how well people communicate with one another, how quickly and fluidly information is passed along. If people are not communicating, if they are not on the same page, no amount of change in the product or marketing will improve performance. Rushing to generalities and ignoring details. Our minds are always hurrying to generalize about things, often based on the most minimal amount of information. We form opinions quickly in conformity with our previous opinions, and we do not pay great attention to the details. To combat this pattern, we must sometimes shift our focus from the macro to the micro, placing much greater emphasis on the details, the smaller picture. In general, try approaching a problem or idea with a much more open mind. Let your study of the details guide your thinking and shape your theories. Think of everything in nature or in the world as a kind of hologram, the smallest part of reflecting something essential about the whole. Immersing yourself in details will combat the generalizing tendencies of the brain and bring you closer to reality. Make sure, however, that you do not become lost in the details and lose sight of how they reflect the whole and fit into the larger ideas. That is simply the other side of the same disease. Confirming paradigms and ignoring abnormalities, anomalies. In any field, there are inevitable paradigms, accepted ways of explaining reality. This is necessary. Without such paradigms, we would not be able to make sense of the world. But sometimes these paradigms end up dominating our way of thinking. We routinely look for patterns in the world that confirm the paradigms we already believe in. The things that do not fit the paradigm, the anomalies, tend to be ignored or explained away. In truth, anomalies themselves contain the richest information. They often reveal us to the flaws in our paradigms and open up new ways of looking at the world. You must turn yourself into a detective, deliberately uncovering and looking at the very anomalies that people tend to disregard. For Charles Darwin, the crux of his theory came from looking at mutations. It is the strange and random variation in nature that often set a species off in a new evolutionary direction. Think of anomalies as the creative form of such mutations. They often represent the future, but to our eyes they seem strange. By studying them, you can illuminate this future before anyone else. Fixating on what is present, ignoring what is absent. In the author Conan Doyle's story, Silver Blaze, Sherlock Holmes solves a crime by paying attention to what did not happen. The family dog had not barked. This meant that the murderer must have been someone the dog knew. What the story illustrates is how the average person does not generally pay attention to what we shall call negative cues. We should have happened but did not. It is our natural tendency to fixate on positive information, to notice only what we can see and hear. It takes a creative type such as Holmes to think more broadly and rigorously, pondering the missing information in an event, visualizing this absence as easily as we see the presence of something. In business, the natural tendency is to look at what is already out there in the marketplace and to think of how we can make it better or cheaper. The real trick that the equivalence of seeing the negative cue is to focus our attention on some need that is not currently being met. On what is absent, this requires more thinking and is harder to conceptualize. But the rewards can be immense if we hit upon this unfulfilled need. One interesting way to being such a thought process is to look at new and available technology in the world and to imagine how it could be applied in a much different way, meeting a need that we sense exists but that is not overly apparent. If the need is too obvious, others will already be working on it. E. Revert to primal forms of intelligence. Language is a system largely designed for social communication. It is based on conventions that everybody can agree upon. It is somewhat rigid and stable, so that it allows us to communicate with minimal friction. But when it comes to the incredible complexity and fluidity of life, it can often fail us. In the last few hundred years, with the rapid development of the sciences, technology, and the arts, we humans have had to use our brains to solve increasingly complex problems. And those who are truly creative have developed the ability to think beyond language, to access the lower chambers of consciousness, to revert those primal forms of intelligence that serve us for millions of years. According to the great mathematician Jacques Hadamard, most mathematicians think in terms of images. creating a visual equivalent of the theorem they are trying to work out. Michael Faraday was a powerful visual thinker. When he came with the idea of electromagnetic lines of force, anticipating the field theories of the 20th century, he saw them literally in his mind's eye before he wrote about them. The reason for this regression to visual forms of thinking is simple. Human working memory is limited. We can only keep in mind several pieces of information at the same time. Through an image, we can simultaneously imagine many things at once. At a glance, the use of images to make sense of the world is perhaps our most primitive form of intelligence and can help us conjure up ideas that we can later verbalize. Words also are abstract. An image or model makes our idea suddenly more concrete, which satisfies our need to see and feel things with our senses. Even if thinking in this way is not natural to you, using diagrams and models to help further the creative process can be immensely productive. Early in his research, Charles Darwin, who was normally not a visual thinker, came up with an image to help him conceptualize evolution. An irregularly branching tree, this signified that all of the life started from one seed, some branches of the tree ending, others still growing and sending off new shoots. He literally drew such a tree in a notebook. This image proved extremely helpful and he returned to it time and again. Studies have indicated that synesthesia, moments in the stimulation of one sense provokes another, is far more prevalent among artists and high level thinkers. Some have speculated that synesthesia represents a high degree of interconnectivity in the brain, which also plays a role in intelligence. Creative people do not simply think in words, but use all of their senses, their bodies, in the process. They find sense cues that stimulate their thoughts on many levels, whether it be the smell of something strong or the tactile feel of a rubber ball. What this means is that they are more open to alternative ways of thinking, creating, and sensing the world. They allow themselves a broader range of sense experience. Stimulating your brain and senses from all directions will unlock your natural creativity and help revive your original mind. Step 3. The creative breakthrough, tension, and insight. In the creative lives of almost all masters, we hear of the following patterns. They begin a project with an initial intuition and an excitement about its potential success. Their project is deeply connected to something personal and primal, and seems very much alive to them. As their initial nervous excitement inspires them into certain direction, they begin to give their concept shape, narrowing down its possibilities, and channeling their energies into ideas that grow more and more distinct. They enter a phase of heightened focus, but masters inevitably possess another quality that complicates the work process. They are not easily satisfied by what they are doing. While able to feel excitement, they also feel doubt about the worthiness of their work. They have high internal standards. As they progress, they begin to detect flaws and difficulties in their original idea that they had not foreseen, and the process begins to become more conscious and less intuitive. That idea, once so alive in them, starts to seem somewhat dead or stale. This is a difficult feeling to endure, and so they work even harder, trying to force a solution. The harder they try, the more inner tension and frustration they create. The sense of staleness grows. In the beginning, their mind teemed a rich associations. Now it seems condemned to a narrow track of thought that does not spark the same connections. At certain points in the process, lesser types would simply give up or settle for what they have had, a mediocre and half realized project, but masters are strong. They have been through this before, and on an unconscious level, they understand that they must plow forward and that the frustration or the feeling of being blocked has a purpose. At a particular high point of tension, they let go for a moment. This could be simply simple as stopping work and going to sleep, or it could mean deciding to take a break or to temporarily work on something else. What almost inevitably happens in such moments is that the solution, the perfect idea for completing the work, comes to them. The stories are so common as to indicate something essential about the brain and how it reaches certain peaks of creativity. We can explain this pattern in the following way. If we remained as excited as we were in the beginning of our project, maintaining that intuitive feel that sparked it all, we would never be able to take the necessary distance to look at our work objectively and improve upon it. Losing that initial verve causes us to work and rework the idea. It not forces us to not settle too early on an easy solution. The mounting frustration and tightness that comes from single minded devotion to one problem or idea will naturally lead to a breaking point. We realize we are getting nowhere. Such moments are signals from the brain to let us go. For however long period necessary, and most creative people consciously or unconsciously accept this. When we let go, we are not aware that below the surface of consciousness, the ideas and the associations we had built up continue to bubble and incubate. With the feeling of tightness gone, the brain can momentarily return to the initial feeling of excitement and aliveness, which by now has been greatly enhanced by all of our hard work. The brain can now find the proper synthesis to the work, the one that was eluding because we had become too tight in our approach. The key is to be aware of this process and to encourage yourself to go as far as you can with your doubts, reworking, and your strained efforts, knowing the value of purpose of the frustration and creative blocks you are facing. Think of yourself as your own Zen master. Such masters would often beat their pupils and deliberately lead them to points of maximum doubt and inner tension, knowing such moments often precede enlightenment. Emotional pitfalls. When we arrive at the creative active phase in our career, we are confronted by new challenges that are not simply mental or intellectual. The work is more demanding. We are on our own at the stakes are higher. Our work is now more public and highly scrutinized. We might have the most brilliant ideas and a mind capable of handling the greatest intellectual challenges, but if we are not careful, we will grow insecure, overly anxious about people's opinions, or excessively self confident. Or we will become bored and lose a taste for the hard work that is always necessary. Better to be aware of these pitfalls in advance and never step into them. The following are among the most common pitfalls that threaten us along the way. Complacency. In childhood, the world seems like an enchanted place. Everything that we encountered had an intensity to it and sparked feelings of wonder. Now, from our mature viewpoint, we see this wonderment as a naive, a quaint quality we have outgrown with our sophistication and vast experience of the real world. But our skeptical, cynical attitudes can actually cut us off from so many interesting questions and from reality itself. Unknown to ourselves, the mind slowly narrows and tightens as complacency creeps into the soul. And although may have achieved public acclaim for our past work, we stifle our own creativity and never get it back. Fight this downhill tendency as much as you can by upholding the value of active wonder. Constantly remind yourself of how little you truly know and of how mysterious the world remains. Conservatism. If you gain any kind of attention or success for your work in this phase, you face the great danger of creeping conservatism. You begin to fall in love with the ideas and strategies that worked for you in the past. You become subtly addicted to the material comforts that you have acquired, and before you know it, you uphold the ideas that you think you believe in, but that really are tied to your need to please the audience or sponsors or whomever. Creativity is by its nature an act of boldness and rebellion. You are not accepting the status quo or conventional wisdom, you are playing with the very rules you have learned. Experimenting and testing the boundaries, the world is dying for bolder ideas, for people who are not afraid to speculate and investigate. Dependency, the apprenticeship phase, you relied upon mentors and those above you to supply you with the necessary standards of judgment for your field. But if you are not careful, you will carry this need for approval over into the next phase. Instead of relying on the master for evaluation of your work, you will come to rely on the opinions of the public, which um, is not that you must ignore these judgments, but that you must first work hard to develop internal standards and a high degree of independence. You have the capacity to see your own work with some distance. When the public reacts, you can distinguish between what is worth paying attention to and what you should ignore. Impatience. This is perhaps the single greatest pitfall of them all. This quality continually haunts you, no matter how disciplined you may think you are. You convince yourself that your work is essentially over and well done, when really it is your impatience speaking and coloring your judgment. Unfortunately, the creative process requires continual intensity and vigor. Each exercise or problem or projects is different. Hurrying to the end or warming up old ideas will ensure a mediocre result. The best way to neutralize our natural impatience is to cultivate a kind of pleasure in pain. Like an athlete, you come to enjoy rigorous practice pushing past your limits and resisting the easy way out. Grandiosity. Sometimes greater danger comes from success and praise than from criticism. If we learn to handle criticism well, it can strengthen us and help us become aware of flaws in our work. Praise generally does harm. Ever so slowly, the emphasis shifts from the joy of the creative process to the love of attention and to our ever inflating ego. To avoid this fate, you must have some perspective. There are always greater geniuses out there than yourself. Luck certainly played a role, as did the help of your mentor and all those in the past who paved the way. What must ultimately motivate you is the work itself and the process. Public attention is actually a nuisance and a distraction. Strategies for reaching the creative active phase. As future masters emerge from their apprenticeship, they all face the same dilemma. No one has ever really instructed them about the creative process, and there are no real books or teachers to turn in. Struggling on their own to become more active and imaginative with the knowledge they have gained, they evolve their own process, one that suits their temperament and the field they are working on. And in these creative evolutions, we can detect some basic patterns and lessons for us all. The following are 7 different strategic approaches to making the transition to the creative phase. They are distilled from the stories of the most creative figures, past and present. 1. The authentic voice. Look at the field like music. In the works of great composers of jazz artists, we can detect a unique voice that comes through the music. But what is this voice? It is not something we can exactly put into words. Musicians are expressing something deep about their nature, their particular psychological makeup, even their unconscious. It comes out in their style, their unique rhythms and phrasing, but this voice does not emerge from just being oneself and letting loose. A person who would take up an instrument and try to express this quality right away would only produce noise. Jazz or any other musical form is a language with conventions and vocabulary. And so the extreme paradox is that those who impress The most with their individuality in music are the ones who first completely submerge their character in a long apprenticeship. By spending some such time learning structure, developing technique, and observing every possible style and way of playing, musicians can build up a vast vocabulary. Once all of this becomes hardwired into their nervous system, their minds can focus on higher things. They can bend all of the techniques they have learned into something more personal, more authentic. And what is true for music is true for any field or discipline. Understand the greatest impediment to creativity is your impatience, the almost inevitable desire to hurry up the process. Express something and make a splash. What happens in such a case is that you do not master the basics. You have no real vocabulary at your disposal. What makes you mistake for being creative and distinctive is more likely an imitation of other people's style, or personal rantings that do not really express anything. Audiences, however, are hard to fool. They feel the lack of rigor, the imitative quality, the urge to get attention, and they turn their backs or give the mildest praise that quickly passes. The best route is to love learning for its own sake. Anyone who would spend years of absorbing the techniques and conventions of their field, trying them out, mastering them, exploring, personalizing them, would inevitably find their authentic voice and give birth to something unique and expressive. Number two, the fact of the great yield. The animal would be divided into two types: specialist and opportunist. Specialists like hawks or eagles have one dominant skill upon which they depend for their survival. When they are not hunting, they can go into a mode of complete relaxation. Opportunists, on the other hand, have no particular specialty. They depend instead on their skill to snuff out any kind of opportunity in their environment and seize upon it. They are in states of constant tension and require continual stimulation. We humans are the ultimate opportunists in the animal world, the least specialized of all living creatures. Our entire brain and nervous system is geared toward looking for any kind of opening. Our most primitive ancestors did not begin with an idea in their heads for creating a tool to help them in scavenging and killing. Instead, they came upon a rock, perhaps one that unusually sharp or elongated, an anomaly, and saw in this a possibility. In picking it up and handling it, the idea came to them to use it as a tool. This opportunistic bent of the human mind is the source of the foundation of our creative powers. And it is in going with this bent of the brain that we maximize these powers. And yet, when it comes to creative endeavors, so often we find people going at them from the wrong end. This generally afflicts those who are young and inexperienced. They begin with an ambitious goal, a business or an invention, or a problem that they want to solve. This seems to promise money and attention. They then search for ways to reach that goal. Such a search could go in thousands of directions, each of which could pan out in its own way, but in which they could also easily end up exhausting themselves and never find the key to reaching their overarching goals. There are too many variables that go into success. The more experienced, wiser types are opportunists. Instead of being with some broad goal, they go in search of the fact of great yield, a bit of empirical evidence that is strange and does not fit the paradigm, and yet is intriguing. This bit of evidence sticks out and grabs their attention, like the elongated rock. They are not sure of their goal, and they do not yet have in mind the application for the fact that they have uncovered, but they are open to where it will lead them. Once they dig deeply, they discover something that challenges prevailing conventions and offers endless opportunities for knowledge and application. In looking for facts of great yield, you must follow certain guidelines. Although you are beginning within a particular field that you understand deeply, you must not allow your mind to become tethered to this discipline. Instead, you must read journals and books from all different fields. Sometimes you will find an interesting anomaly in an unrelated discipline that may have implications for your own. You must keep your mind completely open. No item is too small or unimportant to escape your attention. If an apparent anomaly calls into question your own beliefs or assumptions, so much the better. You must speculate on what it could mean, this speculation guiding your subsequent research but not determining your conclusions. If what you have discovered seem to have profound ramifications, you must pursue it with the utmost intensity. Better to look into 10 such facts, with one yielding a great discovery, than to look for 20 ideas that bring success but have trivial implications. You are the supreme hunter, ever alert, eye scanning the landscape for the fact that will expose a once hidden reality with profound consequences. 3. Natural powers. Because the creative process is an elusive subject and one for which we received no training in our first creative endeavors, we are most often left to our own devices, to sink or swim. And in these circumstances, we have to evolve something that suits our individual spirit and our profession. Often, however, we can go quite wrong in evolving a method, particularly with the pressure to produce results and the fear that instills in us. In the process, many successful artists have developed for their work. We can discern an elemental pattern and principles that have a wide application. Built as they are on natural inclinations and strength of the human brain, first it is essential to build into the creative process an initial period that is open ended. You give yourself time to dream and wander to start out in a loose and unfocused manner. In this period, you allow the project to associate itself with certain powerful emotions, ones that naturally come out of you as you focus on your ideas. It is always easy to tighten up your ideas later on and to make your project increasingly realistic and rational. But if you begin with a feeling of tightness and pressure, focusing on the funding, the competition, or people's opinions, you will stifle the associative powers of the brain and quickly turn to the work into something without joy or life. Second, it is best to have wide known knowledge of your field and other fields, giving your brain more possible associations and connections. Third, to keep the process alive, you must never settle into complacency. As if your initial vision represents the end point, you must cultivate profound dissatisfaction with your work and the need to constantly improve your ideas, along with a sense of uncertainty. You are not exactly sure where to go next. And this uncertainty drives the creative urge and keeps it fresh. Any kind of resistance or obstacle that crosses your path should be seen as yet another chance to improve your work. Finally, you must come to embrace the slowness as a virtue in itself. When it comes to creative endeavors, time is always relative. Whether your project takes months or years to complete, you will always experience a sense of impatience and a desire to go to the end. The single greatest action you can take for acquiring creative power is to reverse this natural impatience. You take pleasure in the laborious research process. You enjoy the slow cooking of the idea, the organic growth that naturally takes shape over time. You do not unnaturally draw out the processes which will create its own problems. But the longer you can allow the project to absorb your mental energies, the richer it will become. Imagine yourself years in the future looking at the back of the work you have done from that future vantage point. The extra months and years you devoted to this process will not seem painful or laborious at all. It is an illusion of the present that will vanish. Time is your greatest ally. The open field. Number 4. Perhaps the greatest impediment to human creativity is the natural decay that sets in over time in any kind of medium or profession. In the sciences or in business, a certain way of thinking or acting that once had success quickly becomes a paradigm, an established procedure. As the years go by, people forget the initial reason for this paradigm and simply follow a lifeless set of techniques. In the arts, someone established a style that is new and vibrant. Speaking to the particular spirit of the times, it has an edge because it is so different. Soon imitators pop up everywhere. It becomes a fashion, something to conform to, even if the conformity appears to be rebellious and edgy. This can drag out for 10, 20 years. It eventually becomes a cliche, pure style without any real emotion or need. Nothing in culture escapes this deadening dynamic. We may not be aware of it, but we suffer from the dead forms and conventions that clutter our culture. This problem, however, sets up a tremendous opportunity for creative types. The process goes as follows. You begin by looking inward. You have something you want to express that is unique to yourself and related to your inclinations. You must be sure that it's not something that is sparked by some trend or fashion, but that it comes from you and I is real. Perhaps it is a sound that you are not hearing in music, a type of story not being told, a type of book that does not fit into the usual tidy categories. Perhaps it is even a new way of doing business. Let the idea, the sound, the image take root in you. Sensing the possibilities of a new language or way of doing things, you must make the conscious decision to play against the very conventions that you find dead and want to get rid of. You do not create your own work out of a vacuum. Your vision builds off what is missing in your field or has turned into a cliche. You take the conventions of your field and turn them upside down. Following this strategy will give your work a kind of reverse reference point and a way to shape it. You must not mistake newness with wild spontaneity. There is nothing that becomes repetitive and boring more quickly than free expression that is not rooted in reality and discipline. You must bring to your new ideas all of the knowledge you have acquired in your field, but for the purpose of reversing it, in essence, what you are doing is creating some space in a cluttered culture, claiming yourself for an open field in which you can finally plant something new. People are dying for the new, for what expresses the spirit of the time in an original way. By creating something new, you will create your own audience and attain the ultimate position of power in culture. Number 5, the high end. In many fields, we can see and diagnose the same mental disease, which we call technical luck. What this means is the following. In order to learn a subject or skill, particularly one that is complex, we must immerse ourselves in many details, techniques, and procedures that are standing for solving problems. If we are not careful, however, we become locked into seeing every problem in the same way, using the same techniques and strategies to become more so imprinted in us. It is always simpler to follow such a routine. In the process, we lose sight of the bigger picture, the purpose of what we are doing, how each problem we face is different and requires a different approach. We adopt a kind of tunnel vision. This technical lock afflicts people in all fields as they lose a sense of the overall purpose of their work, of the larger question at hand, of what impels them to do their work in the first place. To avoid this, your project or the problem you are solving should always be connected to something larger, a bigger question, or an overarching idea, an inspirational goal. Whether your work begins to feel stale, you must return to the larger purpose and goal that impelled you in the first place. This bigger idea governs your smaller paths of investigation and opens up many more such paths for you to look into. By constantly reminding yourself of your purpose, you'll prevent yourself from fetishizing certain techniques or from becoming overly obsessed with trivial details. In this way, you will play. Wait, I'll come back. I'll come in 30 minutes. 1 second. This bigger idea governs your smaller paths on investigation and opens up much such paths for you to look into. By constantly reminding yourself of your purpose, you will prevent yourself from fetishizing certain techniques or from becoming overly obsessed with your trivial details. In this way, you will play into the natural strengths of the human brain, which wants to look for connections on higher and higher levels. Number 6, the evolutionary hijack. We generally have a misconception about the inventive and creative powers of the human mind. We imagine that creative people have an interesting idea which they then process to elaborate and refine in a somewhat linear process. The truth, however, is much messier and more complex. Creativity actually resembles a process known in nature as evolutionary hijacking. In evolution, accidents and contingencies play an enormous role. For instance, the feathers evolved from reptilian scales, their purpose being to keep birds warm. Birds evolved from reptiles, but eventually those existing feathers became adapted for the purpose of flying, transforming into wing feathers. For our own primate ancestors living in trees, the form of the hand largely evolved out of the need to grasp branches with speed and agility. Our early hominid ancestors walking on the ground found this intricately developed hand quite usefully for manipulating rocks, making tools, and gesturing in communication. Perhaps language itself developed as a strictly social tool and became hijacked as a means of reasoning. Making human consciousness itself the product of an accident, human creativity generally follows a similar path, perhaps indicating a kind of organic fatality to the creation of anything. Ideas do not come to us out of nowhere. Instead, we come upon something by accident. For instance, a piece of information overheard in a conversation or an ad on the radio. If we experience enough at the moment and the moment is ripe, this accidental encounter will spark some interesting associations and ideas in us. In looking at the particular materials we can work with, we suddenly see another way to use them. All along the way, contingencies pop up that reveal different paths we can take, and if they are promising, we follow them, not sure of where they will lead. Instead of the straight line, development from ideas to fruition, the creative process is more like the crooked branching of a tree. The lesson is simple. What constitutes creativity is the openness and adaptability of our spirit. When we see or experience something, we must be able to look at it from several angles. To see other possibilities beyond the obvious ones, we imagine that the objects around us can be used and co opted for different purposes. We do not hold on to our original ideas out of sheer stubbornness or because our ego is tied up with its rightness. Instead, we move with what presents itself to us in the moment, exploring and exploiting different branches and contingencies. We thus manage to turn featherless into flying material. The difference then is not in some initial creative power of the brain, but in how we look at the world and fluidity with which we can reframe what we see. Creativity and adaptability are inseparable. Number 7, alchemical creativity and the conscious. Our culture depends in many ways on the creation of standards and conventions that we all must adhere to. These conventions are often expressed in terms of opposites, goods and evil, beautiful, ugly, painful, pleasurable, rational and irrational, intellectual and sensual. Believing in these opposites give our world a sense of cohesion and comfort. To imagine that something can be intellectual and sensual, pleasurable and painful, real and unreal, good and bad, masculine and feminine is too chaotic and disturbing for us. Life, however, is more fluid and complex. Our desire and experiences do not fit neatly into these tidy categories. Those who think in dualities, believing that there is such a as real and such a real as unreal, that they are distinct entities, can never become blended into a third. Alchemical elements are created limited, and their work can quickly become dead and predictable. To maintain a dualistic approach to life requires that we repress many observable truths. But in our unconscious, in our dreams, we often let go of the need to create categories for everything and are able to mix seemingly disparate or contradictory ideas and feelings together with ease. Your task as a creative thinker is to actively explore the unconscious and contradictory parts of your personality and to examine similar contradictions and tensions in the world at large. Expressing these tensions within your work in any medium will create a powerful effect on others, making them sense unconscious truths or feelings that they have been obscured or repressed. You look at society at large and the various contradictions that are rampant, for instance. The way in which a culture that espouses the idea of free expression is charged with an oppressive code of political correctness that tamps free expression down. In science, you look for ideas that go against the existing paradigm, or that seem inexplicable because they are so contradictory. All of these contradictions contain a rich mine of information about a reality that is deeper and more complex than the one immediately perceived. By delving into the chaotic and fluid zone below the level of consciousness where opposites meet, you will be surprised at the exciting and fertile ideas that will come bubbling up to the surface. Chapter 5, Robert Greene, Mastery.